Okay, so who is this I that you speak of? You say that I have the pleaser, and the pleaser does this to me, or the discerned self does that to me. Who is this me? Who is this I?
Well, this is where we get into a very new kind of idea. You see. In the old days, the word ego was developed, beginning of the century, and the ego was defined as the person in us who regulated things. Somebody had to be in charge, so the ego was in charge. But what Sidra and I learned in our explorations was that the I that we thought was in charge was in fact not an I, but a group of selves. So remember, I've grown up now identified with my pusher. I've grown up identified with a responsibility voice. I've grown up identified with control. That's what I mean by I. That's who I am. And don't try to convince me otherwise, because I know who I am. Of course, my older son, let's say, is completely opposite, completely irresponsible, completely this or that. That doesn't matter to me. He's just different than I am, and he doesn't know the right way to be. So, if you help to make me aware of the fact that I'm identified with responsibility, and you separate me from it, and if you can separate me from my pusher, and if you can separate me from my control, okay? So now they're all on my right side here, okay? They're all on my right side. Now I'm separated from them. So we have to give a new name to the me that's sitting here, because I'm no longer married to this group over here. So the name that we give to that is the aware ego. We just made up that name because it seemed to be the best we could do. That means that we have separated from the ordinary ego, which is all these primary selves. I now have an aware ego in relationship to them.
So for somebody who is thinking, I am, it's basically, in truth, a group of different sub-personalities, a little gang of them.
Right.
So what is the other side of the ego? We hear of the term the shadow. What is that exactly?
Well, now I'm sitting here now, and I have finally been able, with your help, to separate from this group of people. They're still very important. They still are the main people I have in my life, okay? But because I've separated, I get a reward. And my reward is I find out that I have a kind of a beach bum in me. Now, they're terrified of the beach bum because they only know work. But when we go on a holiday, when Sidra and I go on a holiday, she's very happy that I now have a beach bum because she has a lot of fun with my beach bum. And I discover that I have a voice that really is more spiritual. Now, that spiritual side could never come out before because I was so busy on this railroad track, going so fast and so speedy, I never had time to sit still long enough to have a spiritual feeling. So suddenly I become aware of selves on the other side. The name that Jung gave originally to the other side was the shadow. We don't use that ourselves because we find that it tends to have a kind of pejorative meaning for most people, like it's something more dark and sinister. But really, there's nothing dark and sinister about the other side. It's just a group of selves that's the opposite to this, you see. And now I have this amazing opportunity. We go away on our holiday. These guys want me to do some work. These guys want me to play and meditate. And I have a choice to make about how much of this I do and how much of the other I do.
So it gives you freedom.
It gives you wide freedom. As an artist using a palette, I was only painting with black, brown, gray, all the darker colors. Now I have red and yellow and greens and golds. I have a much more complete palette available to me, which means a much richer and broader life.
If you start to get the sense of being made up of all these selves. That's the reward for separating from the primary self. That's the reward for taking the risk of encountering your vulnerability head on and giving up the rightness of a particular primary self system. Because when I live with a particular primary self system, that self has the world figured out according to its rules. If I separate from that, things are not quite so solid and I'm a little bit more vulnerable, but the reward is anything is possible. And I have charge of my own psychological car, or sometimes we like to use the image of I conduct my own orchestra. And the primary self, say, is my violin. And I've been working in life with a violin section, no drums, no woodwinds. And as I separate from knowing that I can do violins, I can start pulling in other parts of my orchestra. Some of these might be a little frightening to me because if I know violins, the drums might make me a little uncomfortable. But there might be others I wish I could have played, and I can learn to play them.
That's where this work is very different than other systems. We don't try to bring parts together or reconcile their differences. We like the differences. We honor all of these different parts and learn how to use them.
So it's not a process of integrating into one giant single self.
God forbid.
That would be very boring and it wouldn't work. And then each of these parts or selves loses its uniqueness and its ability to pick up one piece of the entire continuum. And it's a terrible loss. You know, when people ask us, how can we integrate opposites? It's always the primary self that's asking. Because the primary self has no possible way of conceptualizing or feeling either how to integrate its opposite. My mind can't possibly figure out how to integrate my feelings. My feelings don't know what to do with my mind. My organized pusher has no idea what to do with the part of me that can sit in a hammock. They can't do it. I can. As I step back, I can. And I can call them in more at will.
Is it possible to somehow muddle up that you're in aware ego when you're in fact in another subpersonality?
We're always confusing the aware ego with another subpersonality. It's happening constantly because you never know 100% if you're in an aware ego. But there are certain subpersonalities that are more confusing than others. The self in us that disguises itself the most as the aware ego is what we call the mind, or the rational mind. If you're identified with the mind and you think that's who you are, and you think that's your aware ego, then you selectively eliminate intimacy. It doesn't exist for you. As we learn in the psychology of selves, the person who is identified with the mind and who is less intimate invariably will tie up or be attracted to or hate people who are very feeling-oriented, who are very open in their energetic reality, who are very intimate, and you have a smashing pair of opposites there that keeps psychotherapists very, very busy. So the separation from the mind is one of the very major pieces of work that we do in working with people. And we literally do it in the same way that we separate from other parts. We use the method of voice dialogue, and in which we talk to the different parts. We have the person move over, and we talk to the mind. And we really get the information from it as to how it operates, and so forth and so on. The interesting thing is that when a person separates from the mind, and they come back to the aware ego, they have that knowledge of the mind, they are very different in their ability to relate intimately. It is really quite a profound change that takes place. We then have the ability to teach them how to be intimate and also communicate with their mind at the same time as part of the training and the work. Now that's a very big step because it means in relationship that you can still use the brilliant mind that's there, but at the same time you can be intimate while this is going on.
So for somebody who wants to have awareness of their mind, what can they actually do to ensure they're not stuck in the mind's own machinations?
The first step is to literally move back, like stepping out of the premise that the mind is based on. You're sitting at your desk and you're writing and you're focusing, and it means stopping for a moment and say, wait a minute now, who's doing this? Oh, that's what he means by the mind. I'm very focused, I'm very analytical, and then you step back, you say, okay, if that's the mind, then I have to ask the question, how do I feel about what I'm writing? I don't feel anything about what I'm writing. Ah, that's the problem. I have no feeling about what I'm writing. It doesn't have any meaning to me. It doesn't stand for anything. My heart isn't in it. In fact, I'm rather bored with the whole thing. So why am I writing it? You see what I mean? It's a process of literally paying attention to what you're doing and suddenly stepping back and saying, who's doing it? Who's talking to this person? I remember many years ago when I was an analyst, I was a Jungian analyst, and the moment of my separation from Jungian psychology came when I was sitting with a client and she was sharing a dream with me. I was very good at dreams in those days. I'd read all of Jung, and I knew all about dreams, and my mind knew all about dreams. It had nothing to do with me, it had nothing to do with my heart at all. And suddenly, as she was sharing the dream, and the person that I was sitting there, was answering her, it's like I suddenly jumped out of my body and I was watching myself talking to her. I was watching the mind of Hal Stone interpreting this dream. And I listened to Hal Stone, and it was nonsense. It was the mind. It had nothing to do with anything. There was no human connection between Hal and this woman. There was no feeling connection. And that was the moment when I separated at a certain level from the mind and from my Jungian psychology. I didn't give it up, but I was no longer identified with it because all a creature of the mind.
When you say you jumped out of the body, what do you mean by that?
Well, it's like suddenly you're watching yourself. It's not a literal jumping out of the body, but it's like suddenly you're watching yourself in a situation. You see, you're watching yourself talking.
An awareness develops.
Like an awareness. Yes, it's an awareness that develops where you're really literally watching this scene while you're actually talking. And you then realize how mechanical a thing has been going on for all the years. Necessarily so. Because my mind did me well. It really gave me enormous information, enormous bodies of knowledge, not experience.
When you say you're watching the mind and you're observing, okay, here's the mind, who is it who's doing the watching at that point?
There are two possibilities. One possibility is that it's awareness. Generally speaking, awareness comes first. The aware ego comes second. Awareness comes first because it is the place that we go to witness what's happening. So it's the first arena of consciousness. It's the first place that lets us know that we are not what we think we are. The aware ego, when that comes in, that gives us the choice to change. I didn't have the choice to change at that time in my life. I was Jungian trained, and that's how I did dreams, and I couldn't press a button and be different. But my awareness let me know what was happening. And that began a process of development of the aware ego. I would say at a certain level that the aware ego, for me, began at that time. I mean, it started to go into motion. I didn't have it till long after I met Sidra, but it really was the event that started me on my own path.
The four essential factors of the voice dialogue system are, firstly, awareness, which is the observing or witnessing state. Secondly, the primary self, those aspects of the personality which people are most familiar with and give a sense of identity. Thirdly, the discerned self, those parts which are buried from everyday consciousness. And the fourth is the aware ego. Is the aware ego another subpersonality?
The aware ego is not a subpersonality. The aware ego, and this is what makes it difficult, is a process that is always going on. So, for example, if you separate me from a primary self, like, say, pusher, at this moment I have an aware ego in relationship to the pusher. But 10 minutes from now, I may not have that separation. The pusher may take me over again. Because these selves are so powerful, the primaries are so powerful, they're like planetary systems. And they literally suck the aware ego gravitationally back into their orbit. And suddenly I'm a full pusher again, until you unhook me again. But with time, I get stronger, you see. So I'm not a subpersonality, no, I'm a coordinator. I'm an energetic process that stands separate from all selves. And because of that, I have the ability to recognize, to perceive, to feel, and to embrace all the different systems.
In my aware ego, I have choice. I'm listening to both sides, or at least I'm aware of both sides. We like to think of the aware ego as moving out of duality and into a position of trinity. When we are living in a world of duality and polarities, there's a primary self that's good and a disowned self that's bad.
For instance?
For instance, being sensible about things is good. Being rational and sensible about things is really good. Being emotional about things is really bad and messes things up, right? That's if being rational and sensible is your primary self. If I have an aware ego, I separate from the rational sensible and I see that there's something to be said for feelings. And I'm in a position of trinity. It's a balanced position. I'm between opposites. If I identify, for instance, with this sensible, rational self, say I'm going to look for a house. I go to buy a house. And I see a house, and it makes a lot of sense to buy the house. It's in a good neighborhood. It's in good repair. The price is right. It's, there's a good garden. It's in a good school district if I have children. It makes perfect sense to buy this house. The only thing is I don't like the house. But if I'm identified with my primary self, I'm going to go buy the house because it makes sense. And I'm going to disown the little voice in me that says, I don't feel good in this house. When I wake up, when I walk in the door, it just depresses me. I'm going to buy the house from oneself and feel bad about it from another.
So that's the duality.
So that's the duality. On the other hand, if I'm identified with my feelings and my reactions to things, I might go into a house that feels wonderful to me. It's just terrific, and not pay attention to what the other side says. I don't care. It's just I feel so wonderful in this house. It makes me feel just as happy as a little girl. I don't pay attention to the fact that it's in a bad school neighborhood and it's overpriced and the plumbing is no good and I'm going to have to fix the roof, right? So I'm again in duality, except this time I'm on the other side. An aware ego takes input from both sides and is able to move out of the duality and then hold the tension until something happens to feed in information to allow me to make a decision that's going to really take both sides into account.
There are great rewards from having that trinity going. So if I have this aware ego between my rational and sensible side and my more impractical dreamer side, that means that my daughter who is a very impractical dreamer kind of person, will make sense to me. As long as I'm identified with my practical realist, I can't relate to my daughter because she carries the opposite primary self. By having both sides available, she gets a real father, and she gets real love and feeling because this other side of me is just like her, and so I'm able to connect to her. So every time you develop a piece of aware ego between opposites, and every time you are able to embrace, not become, but embrace a disowned self, you're able to relate to people in the world who are that way. And until you do that, they are your enemies.
Let's sum up the points so far. In voice dialogue, what was traditionally known as the ego is termed the operating ego, which is made up of a group of primary selves that a person is identified with. Voice dialogue encourages the awakening of the aware ego. The primary purpose of voice dialogue is to identify the trinity of the aware ego, the primary selves, the disowned selves. Another purpose of voice dialogue is to honor all the different selves, subpersonalities, and use them consciously. The aware ego is actually a process in relationship to the subpersonalities. It is easy to confuse the aware ego with a subpersonality.
I feel that it's important to note that as we move out of a system of duality and we can feel both sides within us, this isn't just personal, but this extends beyond the borders of our personal relationships and our personal families. It has implications in terms of politics. It has implications in terms of groups that can't get along, because what is it that makes groups unable to get along with each other, or neighboring countries unable to get along with each other? They're usually carrying each other's disowned selves. So every time that we move out of this duality and are able to embrace opposites within us, we're also able to talk to people from other cultures or other groups who we might not be able to talk to or really feel, because the aware ego allows us, when we're in touch, in contact with opposites, it allows us to make a different kind of connection. That's the gift. That's the incredible gift of this way of looking at the world and of looking at life. As I separate from my primary self, as you separate from your primary self, you're giving up something that's made you feel safe. And you're giving up something that served you very, very well. You're not throwing it out, but you're separating from it. And then the gift is you relate differently to people. You have both sides. So from the aware ego, relationships are just easier. They're easier. They're more complicated. They're more multidimensional. They're more multidimensional. They're richer, and they're more real, because we're not dealing with just projections. We're dealing with an essence kind of connection that you can start making. We're not just dealing from one personality.
Can the aware ego see itself, or is it something that it just experiences as a sense of presence?
It's a sense of presence, and it always experiences itself by separation from parts. It doesn't really see itself. But when two people together begin to meet at the level of the aware ego, that sense of presence is very, very important, because you meet in a very different way than when primary selves meet.
Is it possible, if you are established in aware ego, to induct somebody else, or if you're in a particular subpersonality, to draw them into that particular kind of energetic that the personality represents?
That's one of the real gifts of the aware ego. If we get into something with each other, and let's say that I'm really in a more judgmental attacking mode, if Sidra holds the aware ego space, she literally pulls me out of the judgmental father that I've gone into. In your dealings in the world, I mean, it has an amazing effect with people when you're able to communicate from an aware ego. I remember one time when we were dealing with somebody and they had not performed properly, and we were both very upset and very angry about what was happening because it was important to us. Now, in the old days, I would have really gone after that person because I can get pretty nasty, you know, and his behavior called for that. I'm sure it happened to him all the time, that he always created bad parents around him, you know. And I called him up, but instead of being angry, I said to him, you know, I said, I have to tell you how terrible we feel. You know, we signed this contract with you, and we haven't heard from you. Nothing's happened. It's, you know, we're in this terribly vulnerable position where you have said you were going to do something, you haven't done it, and it just feels real bad to us, you know. Now, that statement had a lot of authority, but it also...
It's not a whining statement.
It's not a whining statement, but it also had a lot of vulnerability. We really were at his mercy. I have to tell you something, that he really, you know, in a very short period of time, he had turned the whole thing around and the project was moving. And later on, he said to a friend of ours that we know jointly that he'd never had such an experience in his life of somebody communicating to him that way. And so, yes, the aware ego can induct and does induct other people into the same process, yes. When in clinical practice, somebody will often say to us, well, I spoke to my husband and I said this and this and this and this, and I was in an aware ego, and he got so angry.
And we say, you couldn't have been an aware ego. If he got that angry, you were probably speaking from some kind of psychological mother or somebody who's trying to control him or explain things or manipulate his behavior. Because people respond beautifully to an aware ego. They really do. They hear you. Even if they can't always give you what you want or do it as you want them to do, they really hear you. The opposite is also true. If you're in a particular self, you can induct just what you don't want in the other person. The most dramatic of that is if you have a really severe inner critic, and your inner critic is on you, and you're feeling miserable about yourself and like you've really done something wrong, you pull the judgment from everybody around you. Everyone around you becomes a judgmental parent. Sometimes they'll be nice for a while and they'll say, there, you know, you really did a good job. But energetically, you pull for judgment.
So it's very much an energy base that we communicate from.
Yes.
It's the energies themselves which trigger, if you like, the primary cells and associated behaviors.
We always say it's not what you say, it's who says it. It doesn't matter. The words don't carry half the impact of our energies.
The energies themselves are the
The
key.
energies themselves are the key.
So you could say that basically it's a matter of being able to balance, like you're balancing on a two-wheeled bike, and hold everything in place rather than eliminate or get rid of or transcend or be separate from. It's actually an inclusive process.
Right. But the balancing is not static. It's more like an ocean liner at sea that has a roll stabilizer system. And you know, when the ship tilts to the right, the stabilizer comes out and corrects it and then comes back. So the aware ego process is like that. You're not going straight. You're constantly receiving all of these energies that want in to take over, and you're gradually learning how to have choice about who comes in and takes over, and eventually you learn how to choose what you want to be there.
One of my favorite images really is that two-wheeler bike, because you are constantly, it's just like when you're riding a bike, you're constantly making your own corrections. If somebody asks you what you're doing to remain in an aware ego, you can't tell them what you're doing. But it's almost from inside, like riding. You have to learn by flopping on one side or the other, and at some point you get that marvelous sense of balance and freedom and moving effortlessly.
You find that a lot of people are seeking inner peace. Inner peace, they mean getting rid of the chatterboxing of the mind. How does that fit into this framework if you're trying to embrace everything as well?
Well, I would say that this idea of getting rid of is like having as your aim sitting very quietly someplace. You have that same sense of peace and smoothness when a bicycle ride is going well. There's that same set of balance, movement, and peace, if you will.
Unfortunately, the idea of inner peace is too much associated with a spiritual system of primary selves that says peace is good and quiet is good and noise is bad, okay? The traditional spiritual disciplines have been dualistic in nature. What I mean by that is that they sort of divide up what's good and what's bad. So basically, what's bad is the body in terms of sexuality or eating too much or things of the physical nature. And also what's bad is what the spiritual people refer to as the negative ego. Now, when they talk about a negative ego, what are they really talking about? They're talking about the primary self system that we refer to as the operating ego. See, they're not talking about an aware ego. They're talking about the primary self system. They're talking about the part of you that wants power, the part of you that's perfectionistic, the part of you that's materialistic, that's after money, the part of you that's arrogant, okay? That's what the negative ego is in their terms. When they talk about transcending the ego, they're talking about transcending those ways of being in the world. They're basically saying that if you are identified with this kind of ego, that you're not going to be able to find God. You're not going to be able to take the steps that you need to take that can lead you to a higher spiritual self. Okay? The problem is that keeps you locked into a dualistic way of thinking. Good and bad. So high is good and low is bad. From our perspective, we look at it very, very differently. We say to you, what's wrong with being arrogant? Let's talk to the arrogance. Then you move over and you separate from the arrogance, and you now have an aware ego in relationship to arrogance. And you now have an aware ego in relationship to power. So we don't see them as negative ego things. We see them as selves that have defined who you are. So now you're redefining who you are. There's nothing to transcend. You embrace God, you embrace Christ, you embrace power, you embrace arrogance, you embrace your body, you embrace your smells, you embrace your passion, your ecstasy, your intuition, you embrace everything. That's a very different redefining of spirituality, you see, in which the aware ego is essentially surrendered to everything and learns to honor everything, and then transcendence simply disappears from the system. Because when the aware ego gets stronger and larger and embraces more and more, the connection to God happens very, very automatically and very organically.
So where does the devil fit into this framework of understanding?
Well, remember now, the aware ego is this process that really has to have a very large stretch, and it is surrendered to all the selves. If we think of the devil as the mythological term that describes what has been repressed in Western culture, then we can come to an understanding of what the devil is about. So what is the devil about? What has been repressed in Western culture? Well, the devil is usually dressed in red, which has to do with emotion and passion. And the devil has horns, so that he has to do with sexuality. The devil has to do with matter, with material gain. And in many of the stories in which the devil appears, he comes up as representing the side that would want material success. When you sell your soul to the devil, you sell your soul and you get in return material gain. So the devil is the part of us that carries all of those naughty things that in Western society have been pushed out as being wrong. So the devil has accumulated a lot of power and a lot of authority. So part of the job of the aware ego is to embrace the devil, not identify with it, not become it, but embrace it, which means embracing the part of you that is greedy, that is materialistically inclined, that is sexual, that wants what it wants, when it wants it, how it wants it, on its terms, and is not interested in the well-being of anybody else. Now, it's very hard for somebody who has been trained in a more Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition to say, good God, I mean, to unleash that on the world is sacrilegious. How can you do that? Well, we didn't unleash it in the world. The fact is, it's in the psyche. You see, it's there, it's a given. And keeping it buried does not do us any good, you see, because a lot of the ways that it breaks out in culture today and in young people happens because an attempt is made to make all of those personality traits negative.
So how do we deal with this phenomena?
Well, since the devil represents certain traits of behavior, the trick is to be able to and to learn how to embrace those traits without becoming them, without identifying with them. That's the challenge. Once we have learned how to do that, we have the possibility of moving through life with one arm around our selfishness that Satan would represent, and one arm around our compassionate, giving behavior. We have one arm around our sexuality and that wants out all the time, and the other arm around the part of us that knows how to control it. So literally, these represent very wide opposites that the aware ego has to learn how to stretch for, and that takes time to learn how to do that. The main thing to remember is that from the standpoint of the primary self, these selves are always terrified that if you let in these, quote, negative energies, unquote, they're going to take over the personality. So the important thing in our work is we never deal with them until there's a strong enough aware ego to be able to handle them.
Let's sum up the points so far. Developing an aware ego gives a person the ability to understand other groups, cultures, and races in a deeper and more conscious way. For a person established more and more in the aware ego, relationships are richer, more multidimensional, and more real. The aware ego is a sense of presence, and it always experiences itself by the process of separation from the selves. When people are operating from an aware ego, they are able to induct, to draw another person out of the grip of their primary selves and into more awareness. The negative ego, often referred to in spiritual paths as needing to be eliminated or transcended, is the primary self system. Transcending the ego means separating from those ways of being and acting in the world without getting rid of them. In the voice dialogue system, the devil is identified with selfishness, anger, passion, sexuality, greed, and desire for material gain. These elements already exist in the psyche.
So, Hal, perhaps you could give us the consequences in one's life of living in this way.
If we think about the definition of consciousness as we speak about it, we have the three levels. We have awareness, we have experiencing all the different selves in life through living life, and we have the development of the aware ego. The reason that the definition is so important is that if we really live that definition, then our tendency to criticize ourselves really disappears. The reason is that most people have a definition of consciousness that points towards learning how to be centered, learning to be clear, learning that we need to stand in some way and have just a clarity of vision. If you line up 100 people, I think you'd find that 95 of them would have that basic idea. So if they get angry and lose their temper, then somewhere they're not conscious, you see. Or if they get in a fight with their husband, they're not being conscious. Or if they smack their kid, they're not being conscious, you see. They're misbehaving. But in this definition, if you think about it for a moment, three levels have to happen. Awareness has to be operating in me, and I have to be experiencing the selves, okay? And I have to have an aware ego that's in process. So let's say that Sidra and I have a fight, which we do on numerous occasions. And so we're really in a negative bonding pattern with each other, and we're going at it with each other. But I have my awareness, because at this point when we get into a fight, I can't even enjoy the fight like I used to. I mean, really, it's not fair. I used to be able to get righteous and really, I loved to nail her to the wall if I could. And now I have awareness, but I can't stop the fight. I have an aware ego at some level, because not only do I witness what's happening, I do control my behavior at a certain level, even though I can't stop the negative bonding pattern. And I am experiencing the opposites. That is to say, I'm experiencing my anger, and I'm experiencing the part of me that says, Hal, what are you doing? You know that this is you're doing as much as hers, and that these judgments, what's going on? Those voices are all happening. I am in the process of consciousness. In the midst of this fight, I am in the process of consciousness, because all three levels are there in some way. Now, what that does for me is enormous. It means that my imperfections, quote unquote, are okay. It means that consciousness as a process does not require me to be perfect or to live out some spiritual vision of what consciousness is about, you see. I really can be a real human being, and as long as those three levels are operating in some way, that's all that's necessary for consciousness. Essentially, it eliminates the inner critic.
Does it make the fight more unpleasant or less unpleasant?
It makes it more funny. The humor comes into the fight much quicker. I mean, we used to get into negative bonding patterns. They lasted a few days. I mean, you went to bed angry with each other, and we really knew how to do it, I mean, Sidra is a very loving person, but, when she gets going, I mean, she knows how to do it real good. And now, how do you stay angry when the awareness is looking down and, and then you hear the voice saying, Hal, you know that it's a disowned self, come off it, So things that would last days now we can sometimes get through in minutes. Sometimes they're a little longer. And the viciousness of them is really, it's just hardly ever there now. And we can say this about, hundreds and hundreds of couples we've worked with and individuals. You watch the whole nature of the interactions changing and so forth. But I must tell you, I still miss the righteousness. Because the primary selves love to be righteous, and I do think those were fun times.
On a very practical note, the plus of getting in touch with an aware ego and holding the tension of the opposites is there are fewer surprises in life. You don't get blindsided. Think of it this way. The primary self is like your right eye, and you see out of the right eye, but if something is happening over there, you're going to miss it. If you work with the primary self and the disowned self, your vision is expanded, and nothing is going to come out from left field and surprise you and get you, because you've already taken that part into account.
When you stand between opposites, you don't get knocked off your feet as easily. You are able to handle things that come at you in the world. For example, on my 65th birthday, I got a little ear thing for my left ear. Sidra had wanted me to get it for many years. Now, my patriarch over here almost died at the idea that I would wear such a thing. He was ready to kill me. My, say, New Age person said, come on, Hal, you know, I mean, a lot of men do this now. It's not the end of the world. Sidra loves it. And, of course, her 3 daughters loved it, and my daughter loved it. And with Sidra and her 4 daughters, I mean, it's a hard thing to resist, you know. So I got it. But the conflict was in me always.
What was it, a little earring?
Just a little stud, a little gold stud there, you see. I made sure it was small because to make him happy. And I finally compromised because a lot of people had strong reactions to it, so I used to not wear it at workshops, but I would wear it personally. One time I forgot, and I had somebody from the East, a psychologist, who sat down in a session, and he looked at me, and he said, Hal, I can't believe this. You know, I've read your books, and I've listened to your tapes, and I just have so much respect for you, but what is with this stud? I mean, you know. Well, his judgment, which was quite strong, I just laughed. It was so funny to me. And I said to him, I know how you feel. I feel the same way. You see, I had an aware ego between opposites. My patriarch hated that stud. And this guy over here said, never mind, let's go for it. So when the attack came from the outside, it didn't knock me off my pins. I could enjoy his reaction. I could play with him. And then he said to me, you know, I'm going to tell you the truth. I've been thinking about getting a stud for over 10 years. I've never had the courage to do it because I didn't polarize. So standing between opposite means that you can handle all the people in the world that are identified with those particular selves. That's the real gift of embracing these selves.
There's an abundance that gets unleashed when you do this kind of work, because as you think about it, when we're identified with a primary self, no matter how good that primary self is, no matter how adequate or deep or complex it is, it has its limitations. So we're always able to add something new into the system, and that's very, very beautiful, and it's very challenging, and it's also very reassuring because we can add physical things in. As we get older, we can add more spiritual things in. It opens a tremendous amount of creativity.
One of the things that it's given me personally is that I tend not to do things as impulsively as I used to. For example, if I am, let's say I'm interested in buying a computer. Recently, I really had this strong impulse that came up to me to get one of the new computer models, and with the new graphics and maybe the ability to have a scanner and so forth. You know, I don't know if it's ever happened to you. It only happens to 45 billion people a day, you know. But anyhow, it was quite strong, and I really came very close. But there was this niggling side of me that you know, was resisting. And what I have learned by working with opposites is I never, 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 never buy or do anything so long as I am bouncing between opposites. You see, so long as I get the sense that if I buy and go with this side's going to rise up and slap me in the face, I wait. And I really give both sides a chance to speak. The same thing applies with Sidra and me, for example, when we're about to buy something. It may be a minor purchase, it may be a major purchase. We have learned through the years that if there's any kind of doubt, that means there are opposites. Maybe one pair, maybe a number of pairs of opposites. And we don't buy, we don't commit to the act, but rather we come home and say, okay, we may do it just talking, or sometimes we even do it in the format of voice dialogue, and we simply stay with the tension of the opposites. I have learned to stay with the tension of opposites, and it has saved me a lot of money and a lot of aggravation.
What exactly is that tension of opposites?
It means that on one side is the part of me that wants that new computer system so bad. You know what I mean? The saliva is dripping. And on the other side is, not yet. Not yet. That's the tension of the opposites. It's being able to handle that. Most people can't handle that tension. So they go with the things that's strongest, you see. And then, of course, when they buy it, the other side rises up and slaps.
And so does your wife. Because that's exactly the kind of thing that happens when one person in a relationship carries one side and the other carries the other. So that if he goes ahead and he buys that without looking at the other side, then I am left to carry, why did you need it? It cost a lot of money. And that polarizes us. This way I get to feel the part of me that says, gee, I'd like all those goodies too, and the part that says, it's too much money, we don't need it, we're not going to use the goodies.
So what about when you get into a relationship, you meet someone, presumably there is doubt in many people's minds, and therefore they may not actually enter into relationships if they feel doubt there, following what you've been saying.
Well, I mean, if you carry the tension of opposites, you live with the part that wants to be there and the part that has questions, and that's not a passive act. This aware ego is busy like a hummingbird. It's carrying the tension of opposites, and there's another reward that comes from an aware ego, a very big reward. As we learn to carry this tension of opposites, our dream process changes very dramatically. Many people who never remember their dreams start to remember their dreams. People who already remember their dreams have dreams that begin to become much clearer. In a way, it's almost as though the unconscious starts to become a teacher to us, where it never had a chance to function that way before. And that happens when we're able to live with tension of conflicting decisions.
When you say the unconscious is a teacher, what exactly in the unconscious is the teacher?
I think Jung described it very well when he talked about the intelligence of the unconscious. He talked about the fact that the unconscious itself operated as an intelligence. He called it an entelechy, like it knew exactly where it is that it wanted you to go. And what it wants is some kind of completion, wholeness, which basically means embracing yourselves. When you study dreams, you find the dreams really are always forcing you to pay attention to your disowned selves and to unhook from your primary selves. I mean, that's what the dream process is about. So the unconscious has some kind of intelligence that literally is helping us to embrace and come to an understanding of these different self-systems.
So the unconscious is not a self in itself?
No, the unconscious is a generic term for a wide range of selves and energy states, ranging from the personal, conditioned parts of our personality to the most supraconscious states that we come to in meditation and other kinds of places. The whole thing.
Let's sum up the points so far. Staying with the tension of opposites is the means of remaining in the aware ego. Standing between opposites means you can handle life more easily. You become less impulsive, any tendency to self-criticism disappears, and it becomes easier to resolve negativity. As you learn to remain conscious of the opposites, your dream process changes and your unconscious starts to become a teacher. Your unconscious wants you to become whole, which includes embracing and understanding the system of selves in your psyche.